Can you hear in the second microphone? Excellent. Okay, Mohammed, I'm getting the thumbs up. We're ready to go. So thanks for coming along, everyone. As Mohammed mentioned yesterday, this is a quick schedule change. I'm giving a second talk. Oh wait, maybe I'm not. So I'm Matteo. I'm the Chief Mobile Opinionist at Tech Travel Geeks. I am nothing to do with that chap who was on earlier on, Matteo Doni from Skyscan. I'm a completely different guy. Look, different t-shirt. Definitely a different guy. So, what we're going to talk about today. So, what is the state of Mockodile? I'll explain more as we get into it, but I'll do some introductions. We'll talk about Mockodile, what Mockodile is, how customization happens, how real users in the real world customize their mobile lives. We'll go a bit deeper into how Android offers customization options. We'll look a bit more in depth into the ROMs and the firmware environments, the communities that formed around that particular customization, and the issues that sometimes creates, or potentially the opportunities. And moving on after that, we're just going to say how to be aware of what's going on in your app. And it's okay to say no. You don't need to make everyone happy. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm definitely not the guy who is from Skyscanner. I'm Matteo from techtravelgeeks.com. Look, the cats are in different disposition. They've been swapped around. Happy Catter Day, by the way. So, who is this Matteo Doni from Tech Travel Geeks? Well, I do a few things, but my key role is as Chief Mobile Opinionist at Tech Travel Geeks. Tech Travel Geeks is a website, blog, which Lukash and I work on. It's just, if you think about it, travel's one thing. But nowadays, when you travel, technology, accessories, gadgets make travel better. Whether it's taking pictures with your phone, whether it's keeping in touch with friends and family, whether actually booking or coordinating your travel and meeting with people on the road, it makes your life better. Some meetings, some events happen at much faster pace, more efficiently, thanks to mobile technologies. So Tech Travel Geeks takes a look at that and whatever else we're interested in, whatever other loyalty schemes or things we're interested in, and we blog about it, we make YouTube videos, we go and speak on TV shows or podcasts about it. So techtravelgeeks.com. So, Mockodile. Raise your hand if you know what Mockodile is, or if you've quickly searched for it on Google or Bing. One person knows, two people know, three. Okay, that's good going. So Mockodile is fake crocodile. There are lots of different breeds of Mockodile in the wild. You'll find leather Mockodile, which is very similar to cowhide, formed to look like crocodile. You'll find plastic Mockodile, which is no animals were harmed in the making of it, as far as we know. And then there's not so much Mockodile, but actual crocodile, which is very fashionable. Not so much in the West anymore, but in Asia it still has a certain market. I'm considered to be one of the world's experts in Mockodile. This is just a running joke from a show I'm on Twit TV. I'm a guest on All About Android, and jokingly I refer to Mockodile because in the US it's not a big thing, but in Asia it is. It's a very popular material for phone cases. And if you think about it, mobile devices are commodities. Everyone has one. Whether you are a super rich person driving a Porsche or a Bentley, you have a smartphone. Everyone has the same smartphones at the end of the day. They're very, very similar. So a lot of people like customizing them. You can go from the absolute extreme at the high end of the market and get a kangaroo or lamb leather Vertu phone. I think there are still boutiques for Vertu here in Dubai that cost tens of thousands of dollars. And they customize them so much that you go in, it's like custom ordering a car. You choose the rubies for the buttons or the diamonds for the buttons of your phone. You choose the particular leather for the back of the phone. If you have a Bentley, you can go into a Vertu boutique with the serial number or VIN to your car and have the same leather that they use for your car seat for your phone. That's the absolute top end of the market, and they're Android devices. So Vertu also customized the software to make it look and feel consistent with the rest of the device. But the same thing happens at the low end of the market. Recently, we've seen efforts from Google with Android One to give out an Android distribution that is light, that uses very little data, that's very efficient. It's the phone for the next billion people. But it's still in its infancy. Companies in certain markets are offering the devices at the same price with their own custom version of Android, but they're also their own custom hardware iterations. So Mockodile is just a symptom of the fact that we've reached a point of commoditization of the smartphone market. People will accessorize. There are shops specialized in selling different types of cases, different materials, different colors, customizing them for you, maybe engraving the wooden case, the walnut cases you sometimes see in malls, or engraving aluminium cases for you. There's lots of options, but Mockodile is my personal favorite because there's so many different types of it. If you go to somewhere like Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, usually in February, March every year, or you go to IFA in Berlin, usually in August, September every year, there are hundreds of stands just selling cases. This is a symptom of the fact that people aren't happy with having the same phone as everyone else. Whether it's physical looks or the way the software behaves, this might be the symptom of a bigger issue. People aren't happy with everyone having the same thing. There's loads of Mockodile. Some hipsters love this actual lambskin Mockodile that you can buy. They're usually about $30, $40 a case. So it is a big market, but it's a symptom of the fact that people like customizing their experience. And we do cover that jokingly at techtravelgeeks.com. Customization is something that we have seen hundreds and hundreds of times in the Android ecosystem. One of the big differentiators between Android and iOS, especially in the early days, was the fact that Android could be customized. Whereas on iOS, your launcher was forced to be the iOS launcher, just the way Steve Jobs liked it. On Android, yes, you had the Google launcher, but you could move things around. You had an app drawer. You could have multiple screens. It was a different experience, and a lot of people loved it because they had more control over their overall user experience, not only of the hardware, but of the software. As a T-Mobile G1 user, you could choose if to use an on-screen keyboard or flip the physical keyboard out of the bottom of the device. You could choose what particular color of wallpaper you got your wallpapers from. You couldn't do that on Apple. So this was an early differentiator between the two platforms, and something that was relatively successful. Now, some people would say this opened up security issues on the platform. Potentially it did, but nothing major happened negative about this. If anything, it was a tool that enabled the Android ecosystem to develop. So we saw Android come along as a relatively small competitor to Apple's iOS. It had customization options, but more importantly, companies like HTC started to create a whole new user experience on top of the Android platform. Not just the look and feel of it, but also they added extra functionality on top of it, which Google didn't provide at the time. This whole ecosystem then grew, and also people started independently launching their own user experiences, their own Android launchers. If people didn't like the look of their icons, they could add their own. This is fantastic. And as our keynote speaker mentioned yesterday, in different markets, people like different iconography. They have different expectations about their user experience. So if you're not providing that as a core part of your product, enable your users to make their choices. We'll talk about it a little later, but be aware of what's happening. Don't say, oh yeah, the user has control of this, it's not my problem. Make sure you're aware of it, because this might be an indicator that you, as a project manager, as a developer, find an issue which you want to solve through different practices in the way you develop your software or different ways or places to release your software in. So the Android operating system, how many of you have seen this before? You see it here. Obviously, this has been one of the big issues for the Android ecosystem. There's a horror word called fragmentation, which means that most often, especially a few years ago, you would buy an Android phone, and it was like a toaster. Who here has bought a toaster or a kettle in their life? Anyone bought a toaster or a kettle? No? Oh dear, sorry. Okay, so the idea is, with a toaster or a kettle, you go to the supermarket or the electrical store, you buy a toaster or a kettle. You take it home, you plug it in, you use it. There's very little maintenance, practically nothing you do with it.
It gets rusty.
After time it gets rusty, but you just buy another one.
Yes, yes.
So with Android, and specifically the Android ecosystem, especially at the beginning, we were coming from a world of dumb phones, of feature phones. And some people's expectations were, oh, it's like a computer. It's a computer operating system. So I expect there will be some updates going forward. But it wasn't. The whole setup of the industry at the beginning was, that's how it is when you buy it. It stays identical. No changes. So people bought devices on very early versions of Android, and there's no feature updates. And it was not just a development issue, it was a whole ecosystem issue, because very few of these companies owned the device from end to end. Part of the software came from Google, components came from multiple companies. Difficult to put phones together, and when they got something to market, that was an achievement in of itself. With Androids, there was also a financial side to it. They hadn't accounted for the fact of maintaining the software after the product release. It was a product that hit the market. They didn't have the resource or the financial go forward to maintain it from that point onwards. And it wasn't just Android. For this reason, we saw the rise of community Android distributions. Just like Linux or Linux, you had distributions of Android which was rebuilt or adapted on top of Google's open source version of Android, AOSP, or Android Open Source Project, such as CyanogenMod. At one point, there were more devices of certain brands running CyanogenMod than the original devices launched. There's more devices running this, particularly with the Samsung Galaxy S3 era. There are more of those running CyanogenMod than there were running Samsung's own software. Sorry?
1+1+.
Funny you mention that. I've got a slide about it. So yes, CyanogenMod was a community effort. Steve Kondik, great guy, really, really skillful, put together an Android distribution, put it out there on the internet, and people started using it a lot. They started making spins. It was such a big and popular thing, and it brought value to the market, that he and his friends decided to launch a company called Cyanogen. So this was a commercial entity whose whole business model was, there's a lot of demand for custom Android distribution. Let's make custom versions. We're really good at it. Let's make custom versions for the phone manufacturers. They're obviously not capable. They don't have the skills or the understanding of their users. Let's solve that problem for them. And Cyanogen, for a while, was a great success. There's a whole range of devices running that from lots of different brands, not only in Europe and the US with the Cyanogen running 1+1, the launch of the OnePlus brand, but companies like Micromax in India were using Cyanogen devices. They had Cyanogen doing the software for them that received regular software updates, feature updates. When a new version of Android came out, they would adapt it and push that out to users. And that was a push to the market and a selling point for a lot of the device manufacturers. OnePlus arguably would not exist today had Cyanogen not been there at the beginning. They had a ripe community of users who loved Cyanogen. They managed to get to market thanks to that outsourcing of creating the Android distribution. So, yeah, go ahead.
Talk a little more about what exactly they did, and if you
So I don't have any exact visuals of that version of Cyanogen. That device actually went through 3 different Android iterations, and the user experience throughout it changed significantly. I'm happy to share that with you later. Not only that, depending on which market you're in, Cyanogen would distribute a slightly different launcher depending on the language settings. For example, once they had localized for Arabic, the user interface for the Arabic-speaking markets was very different from that in Europe.
So they built it on top of Android, but the look and feel was completely
Yes.
different.
So I like to think of it, a lot of people think, what is stock Android? There is no such thing as stock Android. There's a Google experience Android.
The open source apps.
So the open source version of Android is Google's open source version of it with none of the Google juice in it. They love putting that out there and saying we have an open source operating system. But then every phone manufacturer, whether it's Samsung, HTC, Huawei, Xiaomi, they take the open source operating system and build their own distribution. In the same way as a Linux user, you will take Ubuntu and Linux Mint. They'll be built on the same core, but they are different operating systems, very different user experiences. They use different libraries and tool sets. But in the same way, Samsung's Android experience is significantly different from Google's and Huawei's, and they satisfy different needs in different contexts. So apologies, I don't have any slides specifically of Cyanogen, but that was their launch device. It helped launch OnePlus to the company it is today, which is competing with the big players in the smartphone market. And it's all down to that inherent need users feel they have of customization. So it wasn't just Android users that had this issue. Now, I was lucky enough to be in California in 2007 for the launch of the iPod Touch. It was September, Steve Jobs was on stage. He launched the iPod Touch, which was essentially an iPhone without the phone bit. This was revolutionary. It gave smartphone capability to those who didn't have the money for an expensive iPhone, but it also created a platform to distribute applications on. Many iPhone apps were distributed and used on the iPod Touch platform. But just as all those Android manufacturers, at the beginning, Apple thought, this is a toaster, this is a kettle. I don't need to maintain the software. I'm selling it as a one-off. Apple had never done an iPod Touch before. They were used to these little iPods that maybe needed one firmware update every 2 years. That they were, as they came out of the box, they were made to work that way for years until end-of-life product. Whereas with the iPod Touch, if the iPhone got updates, there was a fundamental accounting issue, which was Apple hadn't factored in the cost of updating the iPod Touch. So the first couple of iOS updates that the iPhone got, the iPod Touch users had to pay $50 for. And this was absurd. A lot of people didn't like the idea of it. In the same way that some phone manufacturers in different parts of the world say, I've made a phone, I'm putting it to market, I'm never going to provide an update to it. Now this, in a way, held back Android from a certain level of quality and reliability in the market for a few years. We went from the hazy old days of very strong gradients, from donut to clear, all the way up to Nougat, which is now a very polished operating system, even at AOSP level with nothing on top of it. It's a functional operating system that gets used in many places, including airline infotainment systems. And one of the things that drove Android's explosion globally was affordable devices. This was also down in large part to a company called MediaTek. How many of you have heard of MediaTek? One, two, quite a few of you. So MediaTek are a Chinese company who specialize in building chipsets, originally for feature phones, but they build chipsets for smartphones now. They license designs from a UK company called ARM. They are now owned by SoftBank. The design of the chips, they then build them, they manufacture them, they customize them. And they do so at scale and with very big efficiencies. So your $30 smartphones that you buy on the market today around the world are most likely powered by a MediaTek chipset. They do everything. And it makes it easy for a small company in Shenzhen to go down to the market, buy a few hundred systems on a chip, and build a smartphone. It's one of those entrepreneurial marvels of this century is anyone can go to market in Shenzhen and with 10 people start having a run of 1,000 phones in the space of a few days. You couldn't do that a few years ago, but that's thanks to an open source operating system that's easily customizable and market dynamics. So you find some maybe questionable brands who are evolving into actually very good brands nowadays. Just quick raise of hands. Who has heard of Doogee or Doogie? One person, but that's because I gave you a review device. Ulephone? No? Elephone? No, that's my favorite pun brand. No? You'll never forget it. And Micromax. Yeah, okay, now that's interesting. So in Dubai, by the looks of it, people of Indian origin have heard of Micromax. So Micromax are an Indian company. They played on these possibilities, on the opportunity offered by Android and companies like MediaTek, and started making smartphones in India. They're made in India and optimized for the Indian market. Now, they also partnered with Cyanogen, because at the beginning they didn't have the software know-how. They outsourced that bit of the software experience. But then once they had the capability, they started doing it in-house. That's thanks to the way the open platform enabled people to move forward and develop products and get them to market. Now, that brought quite a challenge. MediaTek themselves hadn't accounted for the fact that their chipsets, which, if we go back to the Android stack, at the bottom, is inherently tied to the Linux kernel that's part of the Android operating system. For you to update the Linux kernel and everything else on top of that, you need to have drivers for the hardware that's actually under there. MediaTek at the beginning hadn't done that. So all the first real generation of Android devices that got out there never got updated. MediaTek suddenly realized it and started developing their own Android distributions in-house. But it was a reference device Android distribution. The companies we were seeing here don't do much more than copy and paste from MediaTek's own reference operating system, paste it on top of their device, and go to market. Their software updates are often just a MediaTek software update. That's how the market is at the moment. It is getting more frequent and better updates. The software is getting better, but it's not down to the phone manufacturers. It's specifically MediaTek who is driving this growth. So that brings in place a lot of challenges as developers of products that are distributed on this platform, on these devices. Often you'll have crashes, you'll have strange behaviors that you can't reproduce, that may be reproducible only in a certain market because that small run of 1,000 phones in Shenzhen made it into the hands of some of your users. How many of you have found these strange bugs and said, works on my phone? Yeah, quite a few. So that's one of the challenges of being an Android developer and releasing an Android app or service out there. It's key that you know your users. Now, obviously, if you're publishing your app in maybe the Xiaomi App Store, or you're publishing your app in the Google Play Store, you have a dashboard, you have some idea about who's installed your device, your app on the device. You have some data from there. Is that really enough? Yes, you can get some crash reports, but there's information missing. It's sometimes a challenge to debug that issue, especially if it's out there in the world. So one of the things you can do is use analytics tools. The more data you have, potentially the more insights you can have. Pure data is pretty useless. You need to be able to use that to optimize your understanding of what's actually happening. You can put some guesswork in there, but this is just a small list of different tools you can use. No prizes for guessing which one does not work on Android here. That's a free tool from Apple, but only if you use it on Apple products. So, but these are all different types of analytics tools, SDKs that you can build into your app, get data, maybe even crash reports. And that's useful, especially if you're developing your app, if you're thinking of your next release. I've had this problem, this one. I might just delete that feature. No one's using it. It's buggy. Just delete the feature. And it's okay to say no. It's okay to say, that's fine. You need to be aware of the fact that you might annoy one user, but you will delight a few thousand users who might never have had that issue or never communicated their issue to you. It's a difficult decision to do, both as a product person and as a developer. As a developer, it's really difficult to swallow your pride and say, yeah, I made a mistake. And yes, I really love this feature, but I have to kill it. It's difficult, but you need to get to that point of maturity of saying, it's a business or a product decision I'm comfortable with. So don't be afraid to say no. If you have a little angry mob of users saying, I really want this feature in my app, I really want this service in the app, say, I'm sorry, it's my product, I'm going to say no. You may have maybe 10, 15 people being angry in comments on Google Play, but if you're delighting the rest of your users or making their user experience better, if the majority of your users are happy and loyal customers, look after them. A small group of angry users can often be kicked up, but if the majority of your users are happy, they will stick with you. So that's all for my talk today. Obviously, these sort of conversations about how the market is going, what happens in these communities, we do cover it on Tech Travel Geeks. We plan on doing so. I think that as developers of apps for the Android ecosystem, it's important for us all to be aware of what's happening in the bigger picture, what's happening in different markets, but more importantly, what's happening in the communities that drive all this customization. Because the communities often, the features and services that are loved by the communities then get adopted by the big players in the market. So how many cyanogen features over the years have made their way into the full Google version of Android or the full Android open source project? I'm seeing a lot of nods here. It's something that has happened. It's been driven, it's a grassroots movement. It's a community issue, but it's ultimately an issue of solving people's problems. If you don't solve them for them, they'll solve them themselves. You can learn from that. So that's all from me. Any questions? Yeah?
So, in your opinion, like, whose approach do you think is better? One step is go to fragmentation, and let's go Android versus the iOS approach.
Yeah, so the question was, what's the better approach? Having a fragmented market and community of users, or having a very controlled environment? So definitely in the early stages, it's best to have a controlled environment. Control everything end to end, own it, say no to users if necessary, say yes to those you want to. And that's worked out for Apple over the last decade or so. But I'd say the tide turned a few years ago. Android has grown, not just in terms of users, but the overall software quality, because of that community distribution of ownership. Google owns the core part of the operating system. Some other companies own the experience on top of that, whether that's through third-party apps or building on top of Google's project for their own use, such as Samsung. Samsung's user experience is quite delightful nowadays. Huawei's MUI user interface Android distribution is very powerful and adds features that aren't in Android yet. Xiaomi in China are doing amazing stuff with MIUI or other Android distributions. It's an open market, it's diverse, but if you develop your Android app to a certain standard, you should be okay. Follow users, at least Google's user guidelines. Not always. The community can turn into angry little mobs, but I'd say in the long run, this community thing is going to be why Android is already dominating certain markets and will go on to take market share from Apple year over year. Apple have very deep pockets. They are very good at marketing. But ultimately, the value they deliver to their users is being eroded by the increased value you get, the increased bang for buck you get from Android, whether that's from Huawei, whether that's from Xiaomi, whether that's from Samsung, whether that's from Lenovo or Motorola or Lenovo as they're now known. There's a big range of brands, and there's also diversity. A lot of these products, because they're not developed end-to-end for one specific market or for one idea of a market, can be targeted at user groups in such a way that they satisfy their need. For example, I don't have it here, but in my bag, I have one of the new BlackBerries running Android. Who thought physical QWERTY keyboards would be back this year? And they are, and they're great devices, ideal for business users. So I think at the beginning, iOS was the right way to do it, end-to-end control, but the community and also the sheer scale of the market has made Android definitely win. Yes.
How do you think, if at all, that will change if Apple were to decide by itself or through a subsidiary company enter the low segment markets?
I would say that changes market by market. So somewhere like the US, this would be an enormous success for Apple. Somewhere like the UK, France, Germany, this would be an enormous success. But even within Europe, Spain, Italy, Greece, Apple would struggle to have a value proposition there. So many users are now entrenched in the Android ecosystem. Or, on the other hand, the platform they're on is absolutely irrelevant. So if I turn to China, look at WeChat. Look at what that has caused as an issue for Apple. So Ben Thompson from Stratechery has a great piece about this. It's from March last year, about why Apple essentially has failed to maintain its market in China. So Apple launched just over 3 years ago in China, officially started selling Apple products there, specifically the iPhone. They even customized the experience for the Chinese market because they had to open up to third-party app stores, unheard of on Apple elsewhere. But in China, they make it happen because that's the way the market wants it. But those users who bought their iPhones 3 years ago, when it came time to upgrade, did not upgrade to another iPhone, or the majority of them didn't. They went to Xiaomi, they went to Huawei, who in the last 2 years, in those 2 years' time, had obviously improved their products, but the key thing was the platform wasn't important. The key services they wanted, Didi, WeChat, QQ Messenger, they're all cross-platform. They're platform agnostic. So if WeChat works on your phone, I don't care if I have an Apple or a Xiaomi. So it's a strange thing. So I'm sure that if Apple entered the low end of the market with a subsidiary or they did it themselves, they would be successful in certain Western markets. But in the rest of the world, if WeChat works, if WhatsApp works, if Telegram works, and apps work within that, or your key apps for ride sharing, for travel, for payments, if they all work, that's where there's less of an advantage to having your closed platform in the long run.
What was the name of the piece you spoke about? There was also a piece by
Ben
Ben.
Thompson, stratechery.com. I recommend, if you're in the mobile industry, read Ben Thompson's pieces. You can also subscribe to his paid content. He's an analyst. He's based in Taiwan. He follows the mobile industry both in the West, in the East, in the Middle East, Africa, and writes some very insightful pieces. It's useful as developers to know what's going on, to maybe think, this might be a reason to change my development practices, to avoid issues before they happen. I can share his Twitter profile with you later. Any other questions? Yeah, Yaki? Yeah. So at the moment, China's fragmented in the sense that Google services don't work there. So as an Android developer, you don't have the Google messaging system providing you the services that your app may require. So you need to find alternates, SDKs, and depending on the particular device you're using, the particular network they're using, and the app store the user uses, you need to optimize that targeting of the SDK. Now, one way to do that at the moment is to have a custom build for each market you go into. But it's fragmented, it causes a lot of work. You can automate part of it, but it brings inherent risk with it. Going forward, I can probably personally foresee a bit of a consolidation of these markets in China. So I'm seeing Xiaomi already very strong in the marketplace, providing more services to developers for that, and making targeting the products at Xiaomi devices very strong. Not just in China, but in India, where as popular an option because users might trust the phone brand more than they trust Google. And the same goes with Huawei. Huawei is an enormous company. They have the resource to do it. They have devices on the market, and they can push updates to it. Their updates to their Android distribution are already quite frequent. And just in the last few weeks, they've launched the App Store for Android, the Huawei App Store, in more markets around the world. So if you're not already distributing there, I'd say have a think about it.
Thank you so much, Matteo.
Great. Thank you, Mohammed.